I was ironing his shirt when I found the second passport. Not screaming, not crying, just standing there in our bedroom on a Tuesday morning with the iron still hissing in my hand, looking down at a small burgundy booklet that had fallen from the inside pocket of the jacket he'd asked me to press for his Thursday flight. I picked it up. I opened it. His face. A different name. I set the iron down carefully. I folded the jacket. I put the passport back exactly where it had fallen from, tucked into the lining the same way it had been tucked before. Then I finished ironing the shirt, because I already knew, even if I wasn't ready to say it out loud, that nothing after that Tuesday morning would ever be the same. You know that feeling when the floor doesn't move, but your body tilts anyway? That's where I was, perfectly upright, perfectly still, tilted beyond correcting. His name, the one I knew, was Daniel Calloway. That's what it said on our mortgage, on our marriage certificate, on the framed photo on the mantel where he's standing beside me at the base of some mountain in Portugal, his arm around my shoulders, both of us laughing at something neither of us can remember anymore. Daniel Calloway, 44 years old, senior logistics coordinator for a mid-sized freight company, husband, stepfather to my daughter Nora, the man who had made me believe, after 7 years of being careful, that I was finally allowed to stop being afraid. The passport I found that morning said his name was Daniel Brennan. I hung the shirt on the door. I went downstairs and made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and watched a bird land on the birdbath in the garden. The birdbath we'd bought together at a garden center in March, the one I'd painted pale blue because he said pale blue was my color. And I thought about the first time he told me he loved me. We were in the car, coming back from dinner at my sister's. He'd said it so quietly, I almost asked him to repeat it. I didn't. I just reached over and put my hand on his and left it there for the rest of the drive home. And I thought, this is what it feels like when it's real. I thought that for 4 years. I should tell you something about myself before I go further. Something I haven't told very many people. Because it belongs to the part of my life I spent a long time trying to leave behind. When I was 26 years old, I watched a man lie to a room full of people. Watched him look directly into the eyes of people who trusted him, my mother among them, and tell them a story that was designed, piece by piece, to make them feel chosen, special, seen. I watched it happen, and I said nothing. Not because I didn't know. I knew. I could feel the lie in the room the way you can feel a change in air pressure before a storm. But I was 26, and I was afraid of what speaking would cost me. And so I stayed quiet. And 6 months later, my mother lost $40,000 she had spent 20 years saving. And the man was gone. And the people left behind were the ones I loved most. That silence is the thing I have carried since I was 26. Not loudly. I don't talk about it at dinner parties. I don't bring it up in therapy. I stopped going to therapy years ago, when I decided that understanding something and being at peace with it were the same thing. They are not. But I learned that lesson slowly. The thing about staying silent when you should have spoken is that it does not go away. It becomes a habit of self-punishment so subtle you stop recognizing it as punishment. You start calling it wisdom. You start saying things like, I know better than to trust quickly. You start believing that your guardedness protects others as much as it protects yourself. You walk through the world with a particular kind of eyes, scanning, cataloging, alert, and you tell yourself it makes you safe. It doesn't make you safe. It makes you lonely. And then, when someone finally arrives who seems to see through all the guardedness to the woman underneath, you don't lower your guard gradually. You collapse it, because you have been holding it up for so long that when it finally comes down, it comes down all at once. That is what Daniel Calloway did to me, or whatever his name was. He arrived at exactly the right moment. That is the first thing I understand now, looking back, that the timing was not coincidence. I was 41 years old. Nora was 13 and beginning to pull away in the necessary, tender, brutal way that 13-year-olds do. My last relationship had ended 2 years before, not dramatically, just quietly. like a light being turned off in a room you'd already half left. I had the house. I had my work. I managed accounts for 3 small architecture firms, a job I was good at, a job that kept me organized and forward-facing and never asked me to be more than competent. I had my sister Carrie and 2 close friends and a garden I loved and a life that was, by most measurements, complete. And yet, there is a particular loneliness in a complete life. It is not the sharp loneliness of having nothing. It is the soft, pervasive loneliness of having enough. Of coming home to a house that is yours and yours only. Of making decisions that affect no one but yourself and your child. Of being capable and self-sufficient and, underneath all that capability, quietly exhausted by it. Daniel found me at a fundraiser for a local arts organization. Not a glamorous event. Folding tables with paper tablecloths. Cheap wine and plastic cups. A string quartet playing slightly too loud in the corner. I was there because one of my architecture clients had donated and felt guilty about not attending, and asked if I would go in her place and take notes on who she should follow up with. I was there as a professional proxy, is what I'm saying. I was there because it was easier than saying no. He was standing near the drinks table, looking at a painting on the wall, a large abstract piece in blues and grays that reminded me of weather. He looked at it the way some people look at paintings, with the kind of attention that suggests they're actually seeing it and not just performing the act of seeing it. That was the first thing I noticed. Then he turned and caught me noticing. And he didn't do the easy thing, the smile, the smooth opener, the joke about the wine. He just said, quietly, "What do you see in it?" Not what do you think of it, what do you see in it? I told him the truth. I said it looked like the moment before something either breaks or passes. He considered that for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly and said, "Yes." Exactly that. That was the beginning. I need you to understand something about the beginning, because it matters for everything that comes after. He was not crude about it. He was not fast. There was no grand romantic gesture, no breathtaking declaration, nothing that would have set off the alarms I had spent 15 years building. The approach was quiet, patient, and perfectly calibrated to the exact woman I was. He called when he said he would call. He listened more than he talked. He asked about Nora, not performatively, not the way some men ask about your child as a strategy, but with what seemed like genuine, considered interest. He remembered small details from previous conversations. He noticed when something was weighing on me before I mentioned it. He cooked dinner at his apartment, a real dinner, not takeout dressed up in nice plates, but something he had actually made, carefully, with attention. He said please and thank you, with the ease of someone who meant them. And he was patient. That, above everything else, is what undid me. He was so patient. 6 weeks before he reached for my hand. 10 weeks before he kissed me. 4 months before the word love appeared between us, quietly, in the car, coming back from my sister's dinner. I didn't know, then, what I know now, that patience, in a long con, is not a virtue. It is a tool. The longer you wait, the deeper the root grows. By the time the plant is sick, the root is too deep to pull without taking everything with it. We were together for 8 months before he suggested moving in. I said I needed to think about it. I thought about it for 3 weeks. I talked to Carrie, who liked him. I talked to my friend Petra, who liked him. I asked Nora, carefully, how she felt, and she said in the particular flat tone of a 15-year-old trying not to reveal that she cares, that it was fine with her if it was fine with me. I said yes. The first sign, the very first one, though I did not read it as a sign at the time, came about 2 months after he moved in. He had a phone call that he took in the garden, standing with his back to the house. That in itself was nothing. But I was upstairs at my desk, and through the window I watched him take the call, and I noticed something. I noticed that while he talked, he did not move his hands. Daniel talked with his hands, always, even on the phone. Even when no one could see him, he gestured as he spoke. as though his hands were part of his thinking. But during this call, he stood completely still, both hands at his sides, voice low, inaudible through the glass. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, he stood in the garden for another 2 minutes before coming inside. He came upstairs, kissed the top of my head, said he was going to make tea, and asked if I wanted any. I said yes. I went back to my spreadsheet. I did not ask who called. That is the first moment I could have spoken. I didn't. I told myself it was nothing. I had gotten very good, over the years, at telling myself things were nothing. The habit had started long before Daniel, of course. It had started the year I was 26, in my mother's living room, when I had sat across a card table from a man named Gareth, who was explaining to her and 7 of her friends how an investment opportunity worked. I had watched him. I had listened to the specific music of his language, the warmth in it, the deliberate pauses, the way he made each person in the room feel individually selected. I had known, with a certainty I couldn't name at the time, that something was wrong. And I had sat very still and said nothing because Gareth had a confident bearing and because my mother's face was open and hopeful in a way I rarely saw it, and because speaking would have required a kind of authority I didn't believe I possessed. I have spent 18 years understanding what that silence cost. I have also spent 18 years confusing the habit of watching and staying quiet with the entirely different quality of watching and speaking up. They look similar from the outside. They feel different from the inside. The first is fear wearing the costume of prudence. The second is courage wearing the costume of patience. I was only beginning, in those weeks after I found the passport, to understand the difference. 2 months after the garden phone call, I found a receipt. It was tucked into the pocket of a jacket he'd left over a chair, not hidden, just left there, the way you leave things when you assume the person you live with won't go through your pockets. I wasn't going through his pockets. I was putting the jacket on a hanger, and the receipt fell out, and I picked it up. It was from a hotel in a city 3 hours away, on a Thursday, when Daniel had told me he was attending a regional logistics conference. The receipt was for 2 nights. The name on it was Daniel Brennan. I stared at it for a long time. Then I put it back in his pocket. Then I hung up the jacket. I didn't mention it that evening. I made dinner. We ate together, the 3 of us. Annie helped Nora with her history assignment and made her laugh twice. And after she went to bed, he opened a bottle of wine, and we sat together on the sofa the way we always did. My feet tucked under me, his arm along the back cushions behind me. And I thought, there is an explanation. There has to be an explanation. People do not build something like this specific, this patient, this careful, and then have it mean nothing. That was the false belief speaking. I had named it. Years ago, the belief that my silence back then had been the only choice I had. The extension of that belief, the part I had never examined, was this, that the people who stayed were the trustworthy ones. That longevity was proof. That 4 years of a man's consistent presence in my life constituted evidence of something true. I started watching differently after the receipt. Not obviously. Not in a way he could detect. Or so I believed. I watched the way you watch when you are trained by years of scanning carefully, peripherally, from angles that don't announce themselves. I noticed that his work calls were increasingly taken outside, or in the spare room with the door closed. I noticed that his conference schedule, which he used to mention casually, had become something he discussed only vaguely, or not at all. I noticed that once, when I asked if I could look something up on his phone because my battery was dead, he said of course, and handed it to me. And I noticed that in the 3 seconds between my asking and his handing it over, something passed through his face, something controlled, contained, gone before it landed. I noticed. I said nothing. My friend Petra came for lunch one Saturday while Daniel was away at what he said was a colleague's leaving party. I hadn't planned to say anything. I never planned to say anything, which was the problem. But we were on our second cup of tea, and she was talking about something ordinary. And I found myself saying if someone you lived with had two different names, what would that mean to you? Petra put down her cup. She is a thorough person. Petra, a systems analyst. Very literal. Constitutionally opposed to leaving a question half-examined, she looked at me for a moment and said that would mean they were hiding something very large. I said yes, I thought so. She waited. I told her about the passport. Not about the receipt, just the passport, just the name. Petra listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet. She said, "You do know. You just haven't decided how much it will cost." That was the truest thing anyone said to me during all of it. The second sign came from Nora, which I should have expected, because Nora had inherited my eyes, the scanning, cataloging ones. She was 16 by then, sharp in the way teenagers are sharp when they've watched adults carefully for long enough. She said it one Sunday morning over breakfast, almost casually, as though she'd been turning it over for a while and had decided to release it. "Does Daniel have a brother?" I asked why. "I saw someone yesterday when I was at the library, a man. He looked exactly like Daniel. But he was with a kid, maybe 4 or 5, a little girl." I kept my face still. I asked if she'd spoken to him. "No, he didn't see me." A pause. "It was probably just someone who looks like him." "Probably," I said. Nora looked at me for a moment, that particular 16-year-old look that knows more than it says, and then went back to her cereal. I held that detail alongside the passport and the hotel receipt, and the still hands in the garden. And I felt, for the first time, the shape of something assembled. Not a suspicion, a structure. That afternoon, I started searching. It began simply. I searched the name Daniel Brennan in the city where the hotel receipt had been from. There were several. I narrowed it by age, by approximate description. I found a local property record. I found a Facebook profile. Private, belonging to a woman named Rachel Brennan. I paused at that, uncertain. Before I noticed the profile was from several years ago, the account dormant. A different search pulled up a woman named Sylvia Brennan, whose profile photo showed her with a man whose face I could not see clearly, but whose build, whose hands, whose particular way of standing tilted slightly to the right, weight on his back foot. The way Daniel stood when he was relaxed made my stomach drop. I sat with what I had found for a week before I looked further. That week is the one I return to most often when I think about what I could have done differently. I did not confront him. I did not call a lawyer. I told myself I needed more before I acted. More certainty, more proof, more something to anchor the accusation to so that he could not simply explain it away. But the truth I am only able to admit now is that I was afraid. Not of him, of what knowing would cost me, of what dismantling 4 years would mean, of being, again, the woman who had trusted the wrong person. Only this time, I couldn't blame youth or inexperience or naivety. I was 44 years old. I should have known. That voice you should have known is the cruelest one. I have spent a lot of time learning not to listen to it. Those 7 days between first searching and continuing to search were the hardest of the whole thing, in a way that the more dramatic events afterward were not. In those 7 days, the life I had built was simultaneously intact and already over. He came home every evening. He made dinner twice. He asked me how a difficult client meeting had gone and remembered to follow up about it the next morning. He was, in every visible way, the Daniel I had married. And underneath all of that, like water seeping through a floor you can't lift, was the knowledge that he was also someone I had never met. I slept beside him for 7 nights and said nothing. I ironed his shirts. I packed his travel bag when he mentioned an overnight trip to the coast, work, he said. A site visit for a new logistics depot. and I folded his clothes neatly into the bag and handed it to him and kissed him goodbye. And then I sat in the car in our driveway for 20 minutes after he drove away, because I could not make my hands move to put the key in the ignition. That was the bottom of the isolation. The quiet scene the structure calls for the moment the protagonist almost gives up. I want to be honest about it, because the stories that help are the honest ones. I almost gave up, not on uncovering the truth, on doing anything with it. Because there is a particular despair that lives in the question, what does it matter now? The past is the past. The damage is done. You could know everything and still be alone at the end of it. You could know everything and still have to tell your daughter. You could know everything and still be the woman who didn't see it. I sat in the driveway and I thought about my mother. I thought about the $40,000 and about the way her face had looked for the 3 months afterward, not angry, exactly, but diminished. Like a room with less furniture in it than there used to be. I thought about how she had never spoken publicly about what had happened, had never named Gareth to anyone outside the immediate family, had absorbed the loss with a dignity that I had at the time admired, and now understood was simply another form of silence. I was not going to choose silence again. I got out of the car. I went inside. I made coffee, and then I called Carrie. 3 weeks after I started searching, I found the photographs. Not on his phone, not in a hidden folder on our shared computer. I found them in the storage unit. We had a storage unit, his idea, originally, when we'd consolidated our 2 households and run out of closet space for things we didn't want to throw away but didn't need daily. I went there on a Wednesday afternoon, looking for a box of Nora's old-school artwork that she'd asked me to find. I moved boxes, reorganized, stacked, and in the far corner, behind a stack of flat-packed furniture boxes, I found a locked metal case I had never seen before. I didn't open it that day. I couldn't. It had a combination lock, and I wasn't even entirely sure what I was looking for. But I noted its position. I noted its approximate dimensions, and I went home and said nothing. 2 days later, I went back with a pair of bolt cutters I had bought at a hardware store, paid for in cash. Inside the case, documentation. Not a few papers, a system. Carefully organized. Labeled. The kind of organization that reflects not carelessness or panic, but a long-term and deliberate architecture. There were 2 passports. The one I had already seen Daniel Brennan and a third. Stephen Mallory. Both with his face. One expired. One valid. There were bank statements. 4 accounts I had never heard of, in 3 different names. The balances were not dramatic. This was not a man who had stolen millions. The amounts were careful, measured, exactly large enough to matter without being large enough to trigger automatic scrutiny. There were photographs, printed, not digital, 4 women. I recognized none of them. Each had a small collection of photos, not intimate, not romantic, but domestic. Dinner tables, gardens, living rooms. One had a child in several of the pictures. A girl who would have been about 5 in the earliest, and perhaps 10 in the most recent. I looked at that girl's face for a long time. She looked nothing like him. She had her mother's coloring, and her mother's round, careful eyes. But she was being raised in a house that his money was partly funding, which meant she was living inside a structure he had built, the same way I was living inside a structure he had built, and the structural similarity of it. 2 women, 2 houses, 2 lives arranged around the same careful, patient man made the floor tilt again. At the very bottom of the case, beneath everything else, I found the letter. It was in a plain envelope, unsealed, as though placed there simply because he kept everything, because a man who builds this architecture of documentation becomes, over time, a meticulous archivist of his own arrangements. The letter was handwritten, not his handwriting. This hand was older, slightly cramped, the letters pressed with the weight of someone who had written with a pen for decades. The paper was yellowed at the edges, folded 3 times, the creases deep and permanent from years of being kept in exactly this way. It was addressed to someone called Danny. I read it twice, standing in the storage unit with the cold metal case between my hands. It was short, 7 sentences, the kind of advice a man writes when he believes he is being practical, when he has confused pragmatism with wisdom and rationalization with truth. It said you'll understand when you're older. Your mother asks too many questions. What she doesn't know doesn't hurt her, and what she does know hurts her anyway. So there's no right answer. The world is arranged in certain ways, and fighting the arrangement only hurts the people doing the fighting. Keep your head down and keep your options open. Love people as well as you can. That's the only advice worth giving. And the rest is details. It was signed, Dad. I stood there for a long time after reading it, because here is what the letter told me. Beyond what it said on its surface, it told me that this was not the first time. It told me that the man I had married had not invented this. He had learned it. He had grown up in a house where a father managed 2 versions of a life and explained that management to his son as simply the way things were arranged. He had been handed, before he was old enough to evaluate it, a template for love that required concealment. A template that said, the way you keep people is by making sure they never see the whole picture. He had followed that template so faithfully, for so long, that I don't know whether he knew anymore where the template ended and he began. That does not excuse him. I need to say that plainly, because the story I've just told you could, if I'm not careful, slide into something that sounds like an apology. It is not. What he did to Sylvia, to her daughter, to me, to Nora, what he did to the 4 women in those photographs, each of whom had built some version of trust around him, was real harm. Deliberate, sustained, and protected by patience. The fact that he learned it from a man who should have known better does not make it less real. It only makes it older. It makes the wound genealogical, which is a different kind of sadness, but not a smaller one. I photographed everything. I replaced everything. I relocked the case as best I could. The bolt cutters had destroyed the lock. But I wedged it closed and restacked the furniture boxes and left the unit exactly as I had found it. That night, Daniel made dinner. He asked how my day had been. I told him, quiet. He told me about a logistical snag at work, something about a container shipment held up at port. I listened. I asked follow-up questions. I passed the bread. I poured the wine. I went to bed beside him and lay in the dark listening to him breathe. And I thought your father taught you this. Someone taught you that people were arrangements. That love was a structure you built around someone else's blind spots. That keeping meant managing. That being loved required never being fully known. And somewhere inside that architecture, I thought, was a boy who had watched his father do this and had not been given the language to name what he was watching. Who had been told it was simply how things were. Who had, at some point so early he could not locate it now, stopped being able to imagine being loved any other way. I thought about the little girl in the photographs. I thought about Nora. I thought about the woman I had been at 26, watching a man lie to a room full of people, staying quiet, and calling it wisdom. I was not going to stay quiet this time. I called Carrie the next morning. Carrie is 3 years older than me, and has always had the particular quality that I lack the ability to move immediately from understanding to action, without the long interior delay in between that cost me so much time. I told her everything, all of it, the passport, the receipt, the storage unit, the photographs, the letter, the name Daniel Brennan, the name Stephen Mallory. I told her about the bank statements and the property records, and the girl in the photographs and the woman named Sylvia. I told her about Nora's sighting at the library. Carrie listened without interrupting. She had inherited our mother's patience in the right way, the way I had not. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know someone who can help you understand the financial side of this. Her name is Margaret. She's very thorough. Do you want me to call her? I said yes. Margaret had the particular stillness of someone who had spent years inside other people's disasters and had developed, in response, a calm so thorough it could read at first as indifference. Her office was small and impeccably organized. Every surface clear, every file precisely labeled. The kind of order that comes not from aesthetics, but from a professional understanding that disorder costs people their cases. She brewed tea from an electric kettle on a shelf, and she set a cup in front of me without asking whether I wanted one. And I found that small presumption unexpectedly steadying. I laid out everything I had. The photographs I'd taken in the storage unit, the hotel receipt, the names, the account statements, the letter. Margaret looked through all of it for a long time without speaking. She had a way of reading that was more like examining, turning each page slightly, holding a photograph at a small angle, returning to certain documents a second time before moving on. When she finished, she put everything back in the folder precisely as she had found it. Then she looked at me. She said the name, Daniel Brennan, appears in court records from 14 years ago. A civil fraud case, settled out of court before trial. The woman who filed the case later withdrew it. There was a confidentiality agreement. I can find the basic record, but not the terms. I asked, was there a child? She said the court record doesn't mention one. But the property records I found for Daniel Brennan do. A jointly held residential property in Sylvia Brennan's name and Daniel Brennan's name, with a mortgage that began 11 years ago and has been serviced, for the past 3 years, from a third-party account. I'll need a little more time to trace that account fully. She set down one of the photographs, the woman with the daughter, and said, I'd like to know who this woman is. Can you give me a week? I said yes. That week was different from the earlier waiting. The earlier waiting had been paralysis, the suspension of a woman who sees the shape of something and cannot make herself move toward it. This week was active. I had handed something to someone capable of doing more with it than I could. And in the space that created, I found I could breathe again. Not deeply, but enough. I went to work. I met with my clients. I managed accounts and approved invoices, and attended a meeting about a planning application for a renovated warehouse space that one of my architects was converting to residential use. I sat across the table from people who had no idea that the woman taking careful notes about building regulations was a woman who had found a locked case in a storage unit 10 days ago and had not yet decided what to do with its contents. That duality, competent professional on the outside, active internal emergency on the inside, was not new to me. I had been practicing it since I was 26. But I noticed, that week, that I was tired of it in a different way than I had been tired of it before. Tired in a way that felt like approaching the last use of something, like a battery registering its final percentage. Daniel asked, one evening, whether I was all right. We were washing up after dinner. Nora was at drama practice, and he asked it with the specific attention he always brought to that kind of question. Not perfunctory, not rushing past, actually asking, looking at me. I said I was tired. Work had been heavy. He dried his hands on the kitchen towel. He came around the counter and put his arms around me from behind, and I stood in the circle of his arms, looking out at the garden in the early dark, at the pale blue birdbath barely visible in the last of the light. And I felt something so precisely structured as grief that I had to breathe deliberately to contain it. Not grief for him, grief for what this had been before it was what it actually was. Grief for the first time he'd kissed me, for the first morning we'd woken up in the same house, for the evening in Portugal when we'd laughed at the base of a mountain, at something neither of us could remember. Grief for a real experience that had been built on false ground. And the strange, orphaned quality of trying to locate where the real part ends and the false part begins. Because they don't separate cleanly. They never do. He said, "Talk to me when you're ready." I said I will. He held me for another moment and then went to put the kettle on. And I stood at the kitchen window and began, quietly, to plan. Margaret called me from her office on a Thursday morning, 1 week after our meeting. She was careful with her voice in the way people are careful when they are about to say something that cannot be unsaid. The woman in the photograph was named Sylvia Brennan. She had been married to a man named Daniel Brennan for 11 years. They had a daughter, now 9 years old, named Iris. Sylvia had filed for divorce twice. Both times, the filing had been withdrawn. She lived in a house that was jointly mortgaged under Daniel Brennan's name, a mortgage that had, for the past 3 years, been paid from an account in the name of Daniel Calloway. Margaret had traced the account. It was funded by transfers from a business account registered to a company called Calloway Logistics Solutions, which shared its registered address with the freight company where Daniel Calloway supposedly worked as a senior coordinator. He wasn't an employee, Margaret said. He was a director. The company was small, 2 other names on the paperwork. Both of them connected to nothing she could immediately trace, but it had been operational for 6 years, and its accounts were, to the degree she could assess them at this stage, structured carefully enough that no single transaction would draw scrutiny. He was paying our mortgage, I said, and also paying theirs. Margaret said nothing. She let me arrive at the arithmetic myself. The third name, Stephen Mallory, led to a rental agreement in a city 400 miles away. Surrendered 12 years ago, before either Daniel Calloway or Daniel Brennan appeared in any record she could locate. That trail ended there. She didn't say so, but the implication was clear. There may have been others before Stephen Mallory, others she couldn't find. He had been doing this for a very long time. I had, by then, already moved the majority of my savings to an account he had no access to. I had done it quietly, over 4 weeks, in transfers small enough not to flag as unusual, spread across 4 separate occasions. I had also spoken with a solicitor named Diane, who specialized in matrimonial law, and who received the particulars of my situation with the same kind of contained calm Margaret had shown. The calm of a professional who has seen enough of human difficulty that very little genuinely surprises her, but who is careful, because of that same professional exposure, never to dismiss what surprises her client. Diane told me my marriage to Daniel Calloway, was legally ambiguous in a specific way, because Daniel Calloway was not his legal name. The marriage certificate might be voidable rather than void, which meant the process would require careful navigation. She told me what I could and could not do with the financial information I had. She told me about the options for involving the police and the practical realities of each option, and she was honest with me about the likelihood of various outcomes. She did not tell me what to decide. That was not her job. I spent 3 days after that meeting deciding. I called Sylvia Brennan on a borrowed phone from a cafe 3 miles from the house. On a Saturday morning, when Daniel had gone to what he said was a weekend training session for work. The number had taken Margaret 2 days to find. I was not sure, until Sylvia answered, that I was going to be able to speak. She said hello. I said my name is Helen. I think you and I may be married to the same man. The silence on the other end lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Sylvia said, I know. She said it so quietly, so without surprise, that I almost didn't understand it at first. She said I've known for about 2 years. I just didn't know what to do with it. We talked for 40 minutes. I stood at a cafe table near the window with the coffee cooling beside my elbow, and I talked to a woman I had never met, whose daughter had been raised in a house partly funded by the same man who had stood behind me at the kitchen window, with his arms around my waist. And we compared what we knew. She had found his second phone, she said, 18 months ago. She had tracked a name Daniel Calloway to an address, had driven past the address, had seen a house with a pale blue birdbath in the front garden, and a car she didn't recognize in the driveway. She had sat in her own car for 20 minutes. I thought about this later. The parallel of it. Both of us sitting in cars we couldn't move. And then she had driven home and filed for divorce for the second time. The second filing had been withdrawn because he had come home that evening and she had seen his face, his actual, unguarded face, and she had thought, I don't know what I would do if he left. Not because she loved him, not anymore. Because she did not know how to be alone. because she had a daughter who was 7 years old and still called him daddy and did not know any of this. Because the known version of a life, even a contaminated one, can feel safer than the unknown version of an honest one. I listened to her say all of this without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "What do you want now?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want it to be over." We did not become close, exactly. There was too much tangled between us for closeness of the usual kind. But we shared information. We compared notes. We were, each of us, witnesses for the other, and that, I was beginning to understand, was the thing I had been missing for 18 years. Not a protector, not an authority, not someone to rescue the situation. Just a witness. Just someone else who could see what I saw and say yes. That is real. You are not imagining it. The confrontation, when it came, was nothing like what I had imagined. I had imagined it many times. I had imagined the moment I would slide the photographs across the table, watch his face reorganize itself, deliver the words I had practiced. I had imagined him angry, then desperate, then explanatory. I had imagined the explanations most of all, the ones he would construct in the moment, because a man who has built 3 lives is a man who never runs out of explanations. What actually happened was quieter. He came home on a Thursday evening. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The photographs were in a folder beside my tea. Nora was at a friend's house, which I had arranged, which was the only deliberate piece of timing I had managed. He came in through the back door the way he always did. He said hello. He set down his bag. He looked at me, really looked, the way he had always looked, with that particular attention I had first noticed in front of the painting at the fundraiser, and something in my face stopped him where he was. He stood in the middle of the kitchen. He did not move toward me. I pushed the folder across the table. He didn't open it. He looked at the folder for a long moment. Then he looked at me again. And the thing that happened then, the thing I was not prepared for, was that he didn't try to explain. He didn't construct. He didn't reach for the smooth and patient voice I had heard for 4 years. He sat down, slowly, in the chair across from me, and he put both hands flat on the table. And he said, very quietly, "How long have you known?" I told him long enough. He nodded once, a very small nod, like a door closing. Then he said, "Are you going to the police?" I said, "I don't know yet. That depends on some things." He said, "On what?" I said, "On what you tell me. Right now, honestly, no management, no arrangement, just the truth." He looked at his hands on the table. His hands, which usually moved when he talked, were completely still. The same stillness I had noticed through the window, in the garden, during the phone call 18 months ago. He said, "How do you want me to start?" I said, "Start with your real name." His real name was Daniel Brennan. That was true. The first passport was the original one. Calloway was the construction and name he had built around a dead-end trail. Clean enough for a credit check, supported by documentation he'd assembled carefully over 3 years before he used it. He had used Mallory before that, he said, and before Mallory, there had been something else, something earlier, in a city he'd left at 22 and never gone back to. He talked for 40 minutes, not fluently, not smoothly. It was the least fluent I had ever heard him speak. Because fluency requires a performance, and he had. At some point in those 40 minutes, stop performing. What came out instead was halting and specific, and occasionally contradictory, in the way that true accounts are sometimes contradictory, because the truth doesn't have an editor. He talked about Sylvia and about Iris, and about the first time he had filed the divorce papers, and then come home and seen something in Sylvia's face that he could not name, and had called the solicitor back and withdrawn them. He talked about the 4 other women, briefly, and about what he had told each of them and what he had not. He talked about the company and the accounts and how it had been structured, more in the manner of someone reporting what exists than someone defending what was done. And then he said the thing that was not fluent at all. He said it quietly, without looking up from his hands. I didn't think anyone would stay, if they could see all of it. The room was very quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming. Outside, a car passed on the road. I said, "That is not a small thing to have believed your whole life." He looked up then. I said, "And it does not undo what you did. Not any of it." He nodded. I said, "But I want you to understand something. You were wrong. Not about me specifically, because we don't know that anymore, and we won't know it now, but about the premise. About the idea that being known is the same as being left." He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was different, lower, not smaller, but stripped of its professional register. The one I had grown so accustomed to that I'd stopped hearing it as distinct from the natural one. He said, "My father left my mother everything, and she never knew what everything meant. I watched her be grateful for something I knew was a lie for 20 years, and I thought that was mercy. I said it wasn't. He said no. I know that now." We sat in silence for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. The pale blue Birdbath was outside the window in the dark. Then I said, "I need you to leave tonight. Nora comes home at 9. I need you gone before then." He said all right. He went upstairs. He took a bag, one bag, the size of an overnight. He came back downstairs with his jacket and his keys. He paused at the kitchen doorway. He did not say anything else. I did not either. He went through the back door, and I heard the gate at the side of the house open and close. And then the street was quiet. I sat at the table for a long time after that. I didn't cry. I thought about crying. I constructed the conditions for it in my mind, the way you sometimes do when you think you should feel something that is not quite arriving. But what came instead was something more like clarity, a cold, clean sense of finally knowing the shape of the room I was in. Not a comfortable room, but the real one. The legal process was not clean. These things never are. The marriage, my marriage to Daniel Calloway, which was legally a marriage to no one, since Daniel Calloway was not a legal name, had to be unwound carefully, and the financial arrangements took months of careful work from Diane and from Margaret. The house was mine, outright. I had owned it before he moved in, and I had been meticulous about keeping the mortgage in my name. That was luck rather than foresight, but I'll take luck when it comes. There was no prosecution, in the end. This is the part that sits uneasily. Sylvia chose not to pursue charges. Her reasons were her own, and I didn't press for them. The financial irregularities were real, but the amounts, ultimately, did not constitute the kind of clear-cut theft that makes a clean criminal case without an extended and expensive process. He left both lives as far as either Sylvia or I could determine. He dissolved the company. He left the city. I don't know where he went, and I've made a deliberate choice not to find out, because finding out would require a continued attention to him that I cannot afford. Whether he built another life, another careful beginning with another woman who was exactly ready for it, I don't know. I have had to make peace, imperfect and ongoing peace, with the fact that I cannot control what I cannot control. The justice, in the end, was not what I had imagined when I stood in the storage unit with the bolt cutters. I had imagined something external, some authority, arriving to name the thing properly and assign it the correct weight. What came instead was different. The justice was watching him sit across from me with both hands flat and nothing left to manage. And understand, really understand, for perhaps the first time, that the life he had built inside me was real. That the trust he had constructed through 4 years of patience and care had been real, even if the name behind it wasn't. And that he had destroyed something real because he had learned, very young, from a man who should have taught him otherwise, that real things cannot survive being seen whole. The justice was the moment he could no longer perform. That was the punishment. Not external collapse, not legal consequence, but the collapse of the architecture itself. The moment a man who had spent 20 years building careful rooms around people finally had to sit in a room with no walls. That is what he could not manage. That is what undid him. Not the evidence, not the folder on the table, the simple requirement of being seen. The harder part was Nora. She was 17 by the time it was over. Old enough to understand the basic shape of what had happened, too young for it not to be a wound. She didn't rage the way I feared she might. She did something more difficult. She went quiet. Not sullen quiet, not punishing quiet, but thinking quiet. The kind that means she is processing something large and hasn't yet figured out where to put it. She asked good questions. When she was ready. She asked them the way she has always asked questions carefully, as though she has been turning them for a while before releasing them. She asked, did he care about us at all? I said, I think in the way he knew how to care, yes. He just didn't know how to care without hiding. She considered that for a long time. Then she asked, is that forgivable? I said, I don't think forgiveness is what I owe him. I think understanding is what I owe myself. She nodded slowly, and I could see her filing that away. One Sunday, about 6 weeks after he left, she asked whether I had known something was wrong before I found the evidence. I said I had noticed things and not asked about them soon enough. She said, was that because of Grandma, the thing with the investment man? I hadn't told her that story, not directly, but she had 17 years of watching me notice things and say nothing. And she had ears, and she had been paying attention. I said yes. I said I got very good at noticing things and staying quiet about them. I thought it was protecting me. I think it was just keeping me still. She looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I could see her deciding something, and then she said, you weren't wrong to trust him. He worked very hard to be trustworthy. She was right. And she was wrong. And she was 17 years old and already wiser than I had been at twice her age, and it made my chest ache in the way that your children make your chest ache when they grow into something that surpasses you. I kept the bird bath. I almost didn't. The obvious thing, the clean thing, would have been to remove it to clear the garden of the objects that carry his fingerprints. To start with a surface unmarked by him. But the bird bath was painted before I knew any of this. I painted it well. And the birds come to it every morning. And Nora sits at the kitchen window sometimes and watches them. And I sit beside her when I can. Water the garden in the early morning. Don't check the door twice. Some habits break slowly. Some break cleanly. Some you carry so long they become simply a part of the way you move through the world. Not good. Not bad. Just yours. The scanning eyes, I still have them. I always will. But I have learned, in the past year, to do something different with what they see. Not to hold it inside and call that wisdom. To say it out loud, clearly, to the appropriate person, at the cost it actually costs. That is not a small thing to have learned at 44. But it is not nothing. I think about the 26-year-old who watched a man lie to a room and said nothing. I think about what I would tell her, if I could. I think I would say your silence did not protect your mother. But it taught you something important, even if it took you 18 years to understand what. It taught you that you could see what others missed, that the gap between seeing and speaking is where the real cost lives. That the courage to close that gap is not something you are born with. It is something you practice, something you build, slowly, badly, with wrong turns and false starts, until one day you find yourself sitting at a kitchen table with a folder and a cup of tea and the specific, hard-won willingness to push the folder across the table and wait for what comes next. I found that willingness in a storage unit, I found it in a conversation with a stranger on a borrowed phone. I found it every time I asked Margaret a question I was afraid to hear answered. I found it the night Nora came home at 9 o'clock and walked in to find me sitting in the kitchen alone. And I looked at my daughter and said, "I need to tell you something, and it will take a while. And some of it will be hard to hear." She sat down across from me. She folded her hands on the table, her hands, which move when she talks, the way mine do, the way they always have, and she said, "I'm ready." Some people destroy what they love because they do not believe they deserve it. That is not something to forgive easily. But it is something, finally, to understand. And understanding it fully, without flinching, without the comfort of simple anger, is what allows you, eventually, to put it down. I put it down, not all at once, not cleanly. There were months of paperwork and practical difficulty, and the particular exhaustion of rebuilding a financial identity that had been partly entangled with someone who turned out not to fully exist. There were conversations with Nora that left us both quiet for days afterward. There were evenings when I sat in the kitchen in the dark and felt something so close to grief that I had to remind myself it was not for him, but for the years, the genuine ones, the real moments, the actual feeling of being loved by someone, even if that someone was not who I thought he was. Grief for the real parts of something built on false ground. The birds come to the pale blue birdbath every morning. The garden is mine in a way it hasn't been for 4 years. Mine completely. Without the negotiation of another person's preferences. Without the low-grade awareness of what someone else might want it to be. I planted 3 rose bushes in the autumn, in colors I chose alone. They came through the winter. They are going to bloom this year. Nora is 18 now, and she is going to university in September. And the house will be mine and mine only again. And I find that I am not afraid of that. I find that quiet, which I used to fill as quickly as I could, has become something I know how to be inside. Not emptiness, fullness of a different kind. The kind that doesn't require another person's presence to remain full. That is not a small thing, to learn. That is not nothing. The morning after he left, I got up early. Before the light was properly up, I went downstairs and I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee, and I watched a single bird land on the pale blue birdbath in the half-dark, sit for a moment in the stillness, and then fly away. Just that. And I thought, "I see you." I said nothing. For once, that was exactly right. This has been a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Names, characters, businesses, places, and incidents are products of imagination and do not represent any real persons or events.